Gosh, I love that intro. Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well this evening and being safe. My name is John. I am the Tattooed Historian. Welcome to another live stream here in cooperation with the Civil War Institute and my friend Pete Carmichael. How are you, Pete?
I'm doing just fine, John. It's great to see you. Megan, John and I've gone 3 whole days without seeing each other. We were on a streak there, not just in terms of shows, but we were meeting on the battlefield and doing all kinds of things. So
how are you doing? Do you have separation anxiety?
A little bit. Just
yeah.
What are you doing without each other? This is terrible.
Well, it will be a significant test in about a month and a half when John is going off to Canada. I don't know if he told you that, Megan. He's starting his PhD program.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Off to Ontario. Pete won't know what to do. There'll be a border between us.
I
know. At all.
You will live in the borderland of historical scholarship.
Yes.
So this evening, let me introduce Megan Kate Nelson very quickly. Megan is a very good friend of mine. We go back a long way, and I don't know if we can really tell now, but there was a time, I still think there is a resemblance. There was some rumor afoot that she and I were siblings separated at birth.
Yes.
And of course, I was the kid that was shipped off to Indiana land, sent to a city university, and of course, Megan Kate Nelson gets off and gets sent to Harvard. Her life is just so unfair and cruel.
Right. And I grew up in Colorado at the base of the Rocky Mountains. None of this flatland stuff. Yeah.
I grew up in the cornfield, so there you have it. So I'll just say that Megan, after going to Harvard, she went on to the University of Iowa, where she received her PhD in American Studies. She's taught at a number of institutions, including Texas Tech. She's taught at Harvard. She's taught at Brown. And this evening, we're going to talk about her most recent book, Three Cornered War. Mm-hmm. But before we talk about Megan's book tonight, we thought that it was appropriate, absolutely more than appropriate. There was really a necessity for us to talk about the nation's response to the murder of George Floyd. And we asked really a big question amongst the three of us as to what historians could and should be doing during this very traumatic time. And so this will be sort of free-flowing. And we also, as you know, Megan, have access to our guests who often write in questions and comments to Facebook Live. And I heard that both of you have access to Twitter right now. If I were to try to pull up my Twitter account, well, one, I still haven't sort of marshaled how one responds to Twitter and carries on a conversation. So I'm mildly helpless with that. And the technology aspect of it, I'll probably just shut everything down. So I will not look at my Twitter account. The two of you, feel free to pull up questions if there are some. So, and I just also want to give Megan, who wrote me last night as we were going back and forth about what to do for this evening. And she mentioned this, and I think it's, again, a very good and appropriate thing for us to do. So, Megan, what do you think is the historian's responsibility in the wake of the murder of George Floyd?
Well, I think that historians can do a lot of different things. I think we can kind of wield our expertise in a lot of different ways. I think one of the most effective ways is when, someone comes out with some really terrible historical take or uses a term completely, either wrong or in a historically sort of like dense way, to intervene there and to say, no, it's actually, this term has a very long history. You are using it in the wrong way. You should not be talking about this. That I think is very useful. I also do think there is room for historians to provide context, historical context, to say, we're living through this moment right now, and there are antecedents to this. We've seen this before in these certain ways. But I also think there's a limit to that. This morning, a Twitcherstorian friend, Annabelle Lebrecq, asked a very good question, which is, when we write these pieces or long threads about historical context, who are we writing them for? How are we imagining that they are useful? And I think that's a really good question. So I'm wondering what you guys think about that as historians and also public historians. People, you guys are used to reaching out to kind of broad publics. And so I'm wondering kind of what you think the purpose of that particular mode of historical intervention, in response to the murder of George Floyd and in response to police murders of other Black men and women, and then also in response to the protests going on around the country.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I've been thinking about this since, I've been watching it over a series of days because everybody's been watching it and we have to, and thinking about it from a historian standpoint. And I've kind of been selfish in that I've been thinking about it from my own personal history standpoint. My one ancestor fought in the American Revolution in the 7th Virginia, and he owned someone, the only person in my family to do that. And he fought for his liberty, what he saw as his liberty. And I keep going back to the fact that I feel like, as a descendant of his, that I owe it to the descendant of the person he owned, to help them get their liberty. And I have a very personal connection with that in my own way. Now, some people would see that differently, and that's fine. But I think we as historians have to also separate the personal from it as well, which is very, very tough. And we have to come at it from multiple angles as we have watched the historical narrative change over time, and historical memory changes, seems like, by the day, especially when you're looking at it online. And I'm really thinking that it's very tough for some of us to escape our own history to bring about change in a good sense of that word, and to bring about a good, equitable change in that sense of the word, because we do get passionate about it, right? We do say, well, this happened in my family history, I want to right a wrong. And but at the same time, we have to think about the overarching historical narrative and context, like you say. I see it all the time where people are using historical context and it's just way off of the charts, and I don't know where it came from. So I'm really wondering the same question myself as we go around and we look on, what Twitter historians are saying and what we're seeing on different Facebook groups and even on LinkedIn. I'm starting to see it leak over onto there. So I'm wondering the same kind of questions. But for me, it's been more of a personal kind of thing where I feel like I have to try to say something, but also to keep my own biases out of the historical narrative as we do history day to day.
Well, and that's a real tension, right? I mean,
Right.
that I find the personal response being like rage and fear for people and just being fed up with all of it. But that doesn't sometimes kind of coalesce with the historian standpoint, where we're supposed to just be, putting out our objective kind of expertise out there. And we're not supposed to, especially Civil War historians who are dealing with an event, so far in our past, rarely do you see any historians at the end of any kind of article about Civil War history or anything having any kind of like policy recommendation or like prescriptive kind of postscript. And I think that kind of puts us at a little bit of a remove from current events. But anyway, I interrupted you, Pete. What were you going to say?
So Megan, again, I'm sorry if I'm skipping out. You can let me know. We've had, unfortunately, some internet issues in my house today. Megan, the woman that you mentioned, her tweet, her name is
Annabelle Lebrecq. She's a grad student.
The person. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that her observation is a very smart one, and one that has always concerned me, especially when it comes to social media, that we're often just speaking to ourselves, and that we are stretching and straining to be relevant. And it does not just great distortion to the past, but in the end, it inhibits us from doing what you have already said is, I think, our strength. And that's the importance of context and the importance of place and the importance of being sensitive to time. And so I'll give you just a quick example. The Ahmaud Arbery, the young African-American man who was killed in Georgia when he was simply just running down the road. I remember in the immediate wake of that, and I'm not going to name names here, but I did take a glance. I think it was Facebook, in which people framed his murder as a consequence of, or the legacy of, is a better word, of slave patrols. I found that utterly baffling. And again, the people who wrote this are people who I really respect. They are people who I think that this is coming from a good place. But I think the desperation to be relevant, especially amongst 19th century historians, I think sometimes that it does lead us astray. And so we're doing injustice to our responsibility to the past, but more importantly, what we're doing injustice to is that we, more than ever, need to break through what I believe are these facades that come to us from what I believe also is a media that is, I know, easy to criticize, but they give us these images that are so reductionist and simplify things. And we, as historians, need to remind everyone that seeing and believing often don't happen, that pictures don't tell the whole story. And so the images that we're now seeing in the wake of George Floyd's murder, they are as powerful as John has mentioned. And they, of course, create a sense of rage amongst all of us. And we're now all desperate to do something. And I hope we can get more concrete about what to do. But I think we also need to, again, remind everyone that behind those images, there's so many complex forces at work. And if we simply reduce it to just a question of race, I think that that's the beginning point. I think that's the ending point, but I think there's a lot in between. And it's my hope that historians and others can push us in that direction.
Well, and I think we all know, right, that social media is not often conducive to complex, nuanced argument, which has produced the phenomenon of threading, which is still, doesn't do much, right? But yeah, I mean, I agree. We have a role to play, and introducing that complexity is extremely important. But it's also, in this moment, I think, imperative upon us to also, for me as a white scholar, to amplify the voices of my Black colleagues, my colleagues of color, working in a whole range of fields, and also, listen to them and see what they are saying and what they need from their colleagues and from historians. What would be most useful to them at this point? Would it be for us to, to continue to think about these issues and to think about how, for those of you who are professors, how to integrate this moment into, classes moving forward. But then really what, they might want most, and social justice folks on the ground may want most, is, money sent to, bail bonds groups and to organizations that are fighting this fight on the ground. Because I think what we do know, the lessons that we do know from history, especially from the 1950s and 60s, is these protest moments are these sort of spectacular moments in media, but they move toward legal cases and prosecutions, and they depend very heavily on an activist Department of Justice and a strong federal government to really come in on the side of the people. And right now, I think probably like both of you, I'm a little bit in despair about at least those two elements, the Department of Justice and the executive. They're not moving to help things at all. But whatever we can do as historians to push that forward, to move that kind of cause forward in whatever way.
Amen to what you said, though, about what we can't lose sight of. Give money. I mean, if it's something that you believe in, right? I'm not trying to preach to the people who are watching this. You go about your life the way you need to go about it. But I think that point is one that, again, is, I think, lost in all the froth that's created in social media. And I also, again, appreciate the acknowledgement that it is hard to get the kind of meaningful discussions that are sensitive to complexity on social media, even though I participate on it. And I firmly believe that social media does so much to break down hierarchies in all professions, which of course, I think is almost always a good thing. But Megan, I'm glad you said that, because I think about these moments and I think about the things that I haven't done. And I think about the place where I live that I love dearly, and people in this community who I have a great deal of respect for. But then I think about the local police here in Adams County, and I think about Gettysburg, and I think about all they do to make this community safe. But there are moments that I've seen what it suggests to me is that we have a mini army in our midst. And I don't quite understand why. But here's again the lack of responsibility on my part. Have I ever written a letter to the local Gettysburg paper? Have I ever been involved in any way in a local election? Have I raised any of these questions in a place where it truly would matter and where, in fact, I would have to, it'd be some kind of risk that I would really take, right? To go public with that kind of question in a community that I live in, which is deeply conservative, deeply law and order. I am absolutely complicit. And one might say, well, Adams County is not very diverse, and whatever, that's a problematic word, I believe. But we are diverse. We have a large Latino community, and we have a lot of poor people as well. We're not people of color. So we have that constituent here. And I have, for my entire academic career, I'd say, except for a few occasions, been the classic sort of academic who sits back and reads about these horrible things that have happened in our history over time. And outside of my own teaching and my public history, which I do value and I think is important, I've never been boots on the ground ever. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, and Megan and John, I'd be curious in your thoughts and about this. I think that the academic system is increasingly politically neutered us in a sense, right? It's hard now because of the demands for publication and for teaching, where to find the time. And that's a cop-out, I get it. But I'm just curious what you all think about. Why is it that we don't have that? What I envisioned in the 1960s, why have I not seen that in my career in the academy? And Megan and John, be quick to say, you know what, it's happening, you've just been blind to it, and that could very well be the case.
Go ahead, Megan.
Well, I mean, I think there are legacies of activism in different fields, within history and then across the academy. But I do think there is this, as, John and I were saying earlier, academia does tend to try to dampen down a kind of personal investment, I think, in historical inquiry, and really devalue that. If you write a book about an ancestor that's maybe a little bit suspect because you don't have the proper, objective kind of viewpoint, or if you are kind of too closely tied or you're making arguments that are kind of politically active, I think academia generally frowns upon that. And I think that's a huge problem. But I do think it is, every single person's individual decision about how to be boots on the ground, and in what way, right? Like, a lot of different people have different things at their disposal. And especially like right now, in this context of the pandemic and quarantine, someone on NPR made a really great statement that I've been telling everyone now, which is, we're all in the same storm, but we're all in different boats, right? And so and some of us have no boat and are just, flung out into the ocean. And so I think it's important to remember that we all have different circumstances. And so, I may be able to contribute in one way, but not in another. Or I may feel comfortable contributing in one way and not in another. So I don't want to be prescriptive about like all historians now have to go out and do these things, but I think we need to really think about how we are using our voices kind of at this moment and how they can be most effective, how they can bring about kind of the most change, or how we as just people, not even as historians. I mean, I've really felt in the last couple of days just a kind of a failure of expertise. Like I just don't, I don't know what to say really. And I don't know, that would be, important in changing people's minds or giving them proper context. And so I'm not even sure we have to act as historians, maybe just as people who live in this country, which is so deeply flawed.
Well, maybe, yeah, I just real quickly to support what you've said, and I'll throw it over to John. I think that the first thing is that to act as people means that difficult conversations must happen with family and friends. I'm tired of hearing time and time again, we don't bring up politics in this household. Then what kind of household do you live in? I find that to be absolutely immoral, not to mention gutless. And I refuse now to sit back. And I have done time and time again. I've sent Heather Cox Richardson her daily sort of feed from her blog. Heather Cox Richardson, I think, writes about these issues with great intelligence. She always brings in context. Yes, she has an interpretive angle, but it does not overwhelm people. I have sent it to people who I don't think share her opinion, not because I'm necessarily going to change their minds, but because of just what you said. Conversation matters. We cannot sit back and just simply say, well, we just need to be things nice to each other within our own circles. I can't stand for that anymore. And then I'll leave it with this example. And it's an example from your past, Megan. And it's the example that you did at Texas Tech. It always stuck with me. And it was your class, to get them to think about, in a sense, sort of political activism. And I'm probably butchering the assignment that you created. But your students had to come up with some issues, right? And then in essence, kind of protest about those issues. And I thought, you know what, that's a brilliant way of getting them to think about something that was immediate and in their face. I mean, we're talking about, nuclear arms control or abortion. I think it was like parking or something. Was that?
That was one. Yeah, there were a couple of different projects, but
yeah. But I just, the teaching matters. It matters more than ever. And I'm tired of even myself thinking, oh wait, I'd rather go research blah blah blah. So I don't know, maybe if I write a book, maybe 2,000 people, 3,000 people will buy the book. Are you kidding me? I've spent all my time on that. I still love it. But that's a selfish pursuit. I don't care what anyone says in our profession. Our act of scholarship is much value as it has. It does. It's still selfish, and it takes us away from what we should be really doing. And I think coming back to a liberal arts college at Gettysburg has impassioned me to be a good advisor, to be a good teacher. That's where we can really shake the web, as they say.
Yeah, John, what do you think?
I'm thinking that I'm looking at the books behind you on your Reconstruction shelves, and I'm thinking about how we have spoken so eloquently in the past and possibly in the future about issues, very deep issues concerning Reconstruction, concerning the antebellum period, concerning the Civil War and other periods, but yet we haven't acted. And I think it's kind of the thing that's been going into my mind was people in those books behind you, Megan, and those books behind you, Pete, and in my books that are sure Rubbermaid tubs back here, they are remembered for their actions, and they're remembered for what they did and how they did it and how they conducted themselves. Quotationaries aren't a big seller anymore, so the words matter, but the actions matter more to a lot of people. And I think for me, it's been a thing of how can I do better as a citizen, not just a historian, but as a citizen, to act better and act accordingly and be, a good steward of people. And I think that's something that has been going through my head the last couple of days now more than ever, because on top of everything else, this device that we carry in our pocket has changed everything now. Either we're posting it on Twitter or we're seeing people post it somewhere or putting on YouTube, and our world is changing around us and we're seeing it in real time. That's what I think we're going to be talking about in 20 years and less, 10 years, 5 years. What did we do in this period of history? Like we ask our grandfathers, what did you do in 1968, or your grandmothers? I think we're going to have to say that to ourselves in a few years. And I think that's what's most important now to me. But it's just my opinion, and it's just one of millions.
But John, again, you hit on, I think, on a very nice point. And I think that, we are seeing a lot of people sort of stepping up. And as I think it points out what Megan says as well, there's a lot of ways of contributing and making a difference. And We can do it in a very personal and private way. We don't have to showcase it, or maybe we do it in a highly public way. I kind of have a question for both of you. I do, not kind of. Sounding like my daughters. Kind of this.
Maybe have
kind of this. Lights. I'm like, no, girls, it's not that. It's not kind of this. So, I'm curious how you both feel about the description of this protest is in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. It's protest against white supremacy. And so what I guess I'm trying to get at in a very awkward way is the racialization of what's occurred, not just the violence, the killing of George Floyd, and not just, again, speaking of Black incarceration in general, right? The racial explanation of this and the protest against white supremacy. Is this an area where historians can come in and add complexity, or do you think that these racialized explanations, they're spot on?
Well, I mean, I think everything is more complex than just black and white, right? I mean, there are all kinds of structures that have led us to this point, and race and racism is one of them. Structures of poverty and opportunity is another. The evolution of law enforcement in this country, and how they are valued and who is drawn to that profession. I mean, I think there are a lot of moving parts, but I think what is effective about Black Lives Matter and about the use of that hashtag is that it really focuses on the central issue, right? Which is that this keeps happening because certain segments of our society clearly don't believe that Black Lives Matter, right? And whenever we say that, I'm always I'm like, we shouldn't even have to say this. This should not be something that we are forced to point out, that Black Lives Matter. Like, obviously they do, but then you look at these structures of society that have created, this moment and many others, where Black men and women are, killed by police, killed by white people, just when they're out on a run, doing whatever. And there are a lot of things that contribute to that, but I think there is that the centrality of race is there, and everything else it's like the hub on the wheel, right? Like all the spokes are connecting to other societal structures and developments and events and historical legacies and culture. But that is the central hub. So I think it can be both, which is a classic historian's response to that. It can be both of those things and all of them at the same time.
Yeah.
John, I don't know if you agree with me on that one.
Oh, I agree. I'm really happy that we can have this conversation as historians, because I think that far too often historians are overlooked for these types of conversations, along with conversations we have about health and other issues as well. I really think that we need to be listening to more, scientists, historians, and humanities, people who work in humanities when it comes to these things, instead of just talking heads on TV, where, sometimes it's like, well, this is basically, there's a different kind of agenda here, in my opinion. But I really think we need to listen to more historians in the future, and especially now, because a lot of people don't connect events from 1868 to 1968 to 2018. There's no connection there. It's just a reactionary moment, and for many people. And you get passionate, you get fired up, and then some of us are basically able to sit back and be like, well, wait a minute, I need to think about this from a long-term perspective. And I think far too often we lose that because we're ready to make that next tweet, because we're ready to jump and we're ready to react. And I really think that we as historians and others who are watching and listening as well really can benefit from each other, and also can benefit from listening to historians in general and people who have been on the ground and experienced these things, because these are amazing times to be living through, where it's just so difficult for so many people on different levels. And I think that we as historians have a responsibility to be able to connect the dots in more ways than some other people might wish to, want to, or whatever else. I just see that there's power in being, not power as in over someone, but power as in you have the opportunity to provide context more so than a lot of people do. And maybe that's our responsibility.
Well, and I also think I did a kind of 5-question interview for Dame magazine where they were asking about how historians are going to see this moment later. And it was actually about the pandemic and not about, the police violence and murder and protests of the last few days. But I think this is really true, that one of the things that social media is doing is that it's providing so many different people with a way to record their thoughts and their experiences. And this is the thing we really value as historians, right? And actually, Nina Silber just wrote a muster blog post for JCWE where she was talking about how she's writing a journal. And as she's writing it, she's very aware of all of the problems we find in our own sources from the Civil War. You know, we're like, oh, you make reference to this person named Edward. That would have been nice if you had included a last name in that particular presentation there, right? And that, say where you are, say what the weather was like, be very specific about all these details, because historians are going to want to know in the future. And I think this is a really interesting moment where and maybe this is one of the other ways that historians can be boots on the ground, is to record for ourselves and for future historians, kind of what is happening now, and what, Pete, you would appreciate this, right? The emotional responses to this moment, like being very overt about the kinds of, anger and frustration and love and protection, all of these things that people are feeling kind of in the middle of a crisis. I mean, this is the stuff that historians are going to use at a later date to try and understand why this moment is happening and what people kind of felt about it and did about it.
I think that one thing that I hope historians start to point out immediately, and not 50 years from now or 30 years from now, is the reductionism that the media has engaged in, that have made it appear to a not a very discerning public that Black people think and act in uniform ways, and white people think and act in uniform ways, and almost not very often do they overlap. I'm reminded of Devolia Glimpf, who a few years ago gave a talk at Gettysburg, and she met with our students, and the question was angling toward trying to understand again the nature of white supremacy and to try to make linkages to some of Trump's supporters. And I thought she answered the question brilliantly. Devolia Glimpf said, a white man who supports Donald Trump in Michigan is probably a lot different than a white man who supports Trump in Louisiana. And I thought, that is just the kind care, specificity that we need more than ever. I think that we are running the risk here of not getting to the underlying causes. And I think, Megan, you're headed in that direction as well. It's behind the fallout of the response to Floyd. Look, this is not just about the murder of Floyd. I mean, these violence, this riots, it's a range of things that are coming together. And I think, again, Megan, you pointed to all those very well. But and I'll try to control my anger about this. I am utterly disgusted by what I see on TV and cannot watch it. I don't care if it's Fox or CNN. They offer us a version of what's occurring that is aimed almost entirely for ratings. And I am shocked by that. These are individuals who are plenty smart and probably a lot smarter than me, that for the love of God, why can they not say poor Black people or poor white people? Why can they not situate people where they live without reaffirming stereotypes that look what's going on in the cities. Everything's in chaos. This is what Black people do to each other. Hell, they unintentionally reaffirm that position because they're incapable of saying the deindustrialization that occurred across this country since the 1970s has obliterated lives. And no one wants to say it because mainstream media is connected to corporate media and they don't give us what we need. I think NPR does. Hell, I read The Economist now just because I can't deal with that. So for me,
extreme move, Pete.
What's that?
That's an extreme move, reading The Economist. You've been driven to The Economist.
No, there's some good stuff. I like their international, right? They've got great international. So it's useful.
Yeah.
But I just begin to pull back into how these things are portrayed, and then we'll maybe make our way to your book here, Megan. But
yeah.
I did catch a little bit of a tweet, and you asked for people's responses about how Civil War historians have used the methodology of feminist scholars, and I thought about that and didn't think I could write a response within how many characters I could possibly get. So I just kept thinking. It didn't write. But I'm telling you, I love the work of Hannah Rosen. I hope she's on over your right shoulder there. Her book on Reconstruction in Memphis and also in Arkansas. This is what I like about it and why it applies today. She was able to help me understand how the newspapers in Memphis advanced a dominant message, what we call discourse, that legitimated the rape of African-American women. That a middle-class white dude could pick that up and read that and say, you know what, that's the right thing to do. And how the power of discourse, right, and language can shape how not just we understand events, but how we act politically. I think that that's the crisis that's confronting us right now. We have a media, it's failing us. And I don't know, again, I throw my hands up because I don't know what in God's name I can conceivably do about that.
Hmm.
Well, Megan, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to thank you for allowing us to bring this up. Listen, you know what? A lot of people would say, hey, my book's out. I just want to talk about this and nothing else. But it was Megan who said, we need to take the time to do this. So thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Did you want to have any final thoughts, Megan, about George Floyd?
No, I mean, I think your point about the media also we can take and apply the same kind of look at it, right? To say that, you know, media is also complicated. There are some outlets doing a great job. There are some outlets doing a terrible job, you know, and media personnel are getting attacked on the streets by the police. And you know, they're trying to do,
no business for that.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think it's just important in the end for historians, you know, to just think of ourselves as historians and think about what, you know, our job is here, but also to, you know, as John noted before, kind of engage with this and experience this and go boots on the ground as people, as individuals who have our own kind of perspective and our own, you know, sort of interest and political orientation, and however we want to kind of help in this situation. We should strive to do.
I think.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And if Megan, if you
make a final thought.
Oh, I'm sorry, Pete. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Megan,
if
your book sales climb in like 10 years, it's because I'm showing this video to my American Studies class, and, because we're going to be looking back on it and being like, what did we think back then when it was going on?
Oh, right.
So we'll probably get a jump in sales of Three Cornered War here in the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully.
Oh, yeah, well, maybe. We'll see.
We'll see.
Nothing is for certain. You know, come along and all of a sudden things start happening that kind of derail all of your plans. So, yeah.
Here will be my rough transition, and to begin by saying Heather Cox Richardson. I believe she's a friend of yours, Megan. I've never met her, and I very much would like to. I'm a great admirer of her work. Again, go to her blog, or I just get her emails. And every day, I think, again, that's a good summary. So I missed her in my little summary. She's excellent. And she wrote a very important book on Reconstruction in the West. And so that leads us now to Megan, because Megan, of course, is taking us, to get us to Reconstruction, but Megan gets us started with the beginnings of the Civil War. So tell us, why this book? Why do we need it?
Well, we need it for a couple of reasons. First of all, Pete, you've been hearing this from me for years now, since you first invited me to the CWI to present on this, that most Civil War histories completely ignore the far west, the Pacific coast to the 100th meridian, which is basically the 100th meridian is the line where you either get enough rainfall to sustain agriculture or it becomes too arid to do so and you have to use irrigation. So this is one of the sort of lines that environmental historians use to demarcate the West from the rest of the country. And, most Civil War histories focus on the Eastern Theater, some on the Trans-Mississippi. As you both know, I'm on a campaign and I need you to help me. And I need everybody who is watching to help me change the language that we use to talk about theaters. Stop calling the Trans-Mississippi the West. The problem that creates is that people are like, well, what's west of West? There is nothing, right? So the map just sort of ends at the Trans-Mississippi and does not actually extend in this vast region that's 40% of the country. That was very much in play during the war. So let's call it the Eastern Theater, the Trans-Mississippi, and then the West. And then we will have a sort of view of the war as it truly was, which was a continental conflict that extended from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that included all kinds of different communities, including Hispano-New Mexican communities and also Native peoples across the country. In fact, not just in the West, but across the country. Because I think you guys are very familiar with, and especially, you, Pete, when you're teaching your classes, I mean, we talk about the Western territories all the time in the, late 1840s and 1850s when we're talking about the run-up to the war, because this was the thing. Were we going to have slavery in the territories or not? This was the great question, dividing the nation and driving them toward war. But then everybody acts like it's the firing on Fort Sumter, and then the West doesn't matter anymore. Like it suddenly disappeared and no one cares about it. But what I'm trying to do in the Three-Cornered War is to show how the Union and the Confederacy actually still did care very much about gaining control or keeping control of the West during this period. They wanted it for gold. The Confederates in particular wanted the Pacific ports of California. And they also, both the Union and the Confederacy, had this kind of larger vision. And, driving the Union was this idea of this empire of free labor, that like white farmers and ranchers were going to take over. There would be no slavery anymore. And we'd kind of fulfill that Jeffersonian ideal, right, of the yeoman farmers everywhere. And the Confederates had this larger vision of an empire of slavery that would extend from coast to coast, and from the Southwest, where most of the action takes place in the Three-Cornered War, they were going to expand southward into Mexico, possibly the Caribbean, and just expand their empire. So there were a lot of reasons that they wanted to be there that drove the Confederate invasion of New Mexico territory, and then the Union defense of it, and then the turn to those campaigns against Apaches and Navajos in order to attempt to secure the region further.
So is your book, I keep showing the cover, which I didn't say, hey, you know what, seriously, what a beautiful cover, huh? The cover, you could not, you opened up that box, you got your first book, seriously, did a tear come to your eye? It had to. This is a beautiful cover.
It really is. And this is a detail from a Thomas Moran painting, and he is one of my favorite painters. And this is actually a detail from a painting of the Grand Canyon, which doesn't show up too much, although it is in the Navajo homeland. But when they came up with this cover, I was blown away. I mean, I think of my books, a little bit like children, and all of my children are beautiful, but the Three-Cornered War
extra beautiful
is the most beautiful. Sorry. That's just how it is. Yeah.
That's how it is.
Yeah.
So very quickly, Megan, after reading this book, should I now see the Civil War as a war of imperialism?
Yes, absolutely. I think both the Union and the Confederacy were interested in expanding their national empire, and that not only what they were doing militarily, but then what the Union was doing politically. After Union troops in New Mexico managed to chase the Confederates back to Texas, this is when the Union started passing all of those pieces of legislation, which we all know about, but so many people don't even connect with the Civil War: the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created many of the universities in the nation, right, to fund them out of land sales. And all of those are embedded within them are imperial designs. That these are acts of conquest to go and settle the land and farm it, to build railroads across it. Everybody understood, Native peoples understood, that railroads were the engines of empire, that this was the American empire coming, and they were going to have to defend their sovereignty against it. So it was not only kind of militarily a sort of act of kind of conquest and an attempt to take territory, but politically for the Union afterward, since they kind of won the day against the Confederacy, it was that act of imperial conquest against Native peoples.
Megan, I have two quick questions for you. One, which is kind of an odd question, but Pete sees me being the wild card. When you wrote this book, was it written strictly for an audience of historians? Because when I reviewed your book, I said it seemed like it was written like The Killer Angels or Game of Thrones, something like that, where you have characters and you follow the character through different chapters, and you're like, I wonder what happened to this person. I got to read on and see what happens. Was that the initial style of the book, or did that kind of mutate into that style of the book?
Well, I knew that it would be pretty easy for me to write a traditional academic history of the conflicts in this region. I've written 2 books before in that mode. I'm comfortable in that mode. We all write, I was trained to write in that mode. But I wanted to see if I could do something different with historical writing and sort of really push the envelope in terms of what we consider to be narrative history. And yeah, I mean, that you mentioned Game of Thrones is exactly right, because at the time, as I was trying to figure out how I was going to tell the story, because it quickly became apparent that there were a lot of different moving parts. There were communities, there were Native communities, there are, Union and Confederate troops. There are civilians on the ground, both Hispano and Anglo. And how was I going to really capture all of their experiences and convey the importance of this theater in the war, in a way that readers could understand, and that they would also kind of enjoy as a readerly experience. And I had been both reading and watching Game of Thrones and trying to figure out why I was still reading and watching Game of Thrones, given the great violence and misogyny. And I figured out that George R.R. Martin was using this kind of classic multi-perspective narrative, which also is in Killer Angels and in a lot of other literary fiction and non-literary fiction and movies and film. And I was like, this is genius, because this is the way you do it. You put people on the ground with individuals, and then you kind of get them invested, and then you leave them. And you don't come back to them until a little bit later, so that you're always kept kind of wanting to know more about these people. And then you also see with that structure how interconnected everybody is. So many of these individuals actually meet. Some of them just kind of cross paths a little bit more obliquely. Many of them are all in the same places, not at the same times. But you can see how all of their communities are connected together. And that was also important for me. I wanted to give a sense of that, the complexity of that, of all of that interconnectedness, that all of these people are in this place and came to this place on these very long roads. And all of them are then kind of coalesce in one general space. And then many of them kind of depart also. So that was the way I decided. That's how I hit upon the structure for the book. I'd never written anything like that before. It was a little bit of a hard sell to agents and to editors. they were trying to figure out if I could pull it off. But I you only have to convince one. This is the good thing. I was able to convince one agent and one editor to take a chance on this storytelling style. So I'm glad, John, that you found it, sort of a compelling read from that standpoint, that you wanted to keep reading. I wanted to create that sense of kind of narrative propulsion, while also giving you a really good sense of kind of what it was like to be in New Mexico and Arizona and Texas and Colorado and Southern California during this pivotal moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was awesome doing that. And my other question, Megan, before I turn back over to Pete, was about, I did not realize the scope until I read your book of indigenous enslavement. I was struck by how that operated and the scale and such like that, because we tend to just think about enslavement as it is perceived in the South, Southeast. Don't think about it in the West. Do you think that a lot of people are surprised by that as a whole, because we're taught a certain way and we just don't think about indigenous enslavement?
I think Civil War historians are. I think Western historians are not as surprised, because in Western history, this has been a topic of a lot of scholarship. James Brooks's book, Captives and Cousins, and then also recently Andres de Zendez's The Other Slavery. These kinds of works have really put that front and center. And also Stacy Smith's book, where she's analyzing kind of in the West all of these different kinds of what she calls unfree labor, right? It's sort of different modes of, it can be enslavement in one case, it can be peonage in another place, it can be, other kinds of things that we might understand as indentured servitude. And all of these are working, though, to create a power structure that is quite similar to the power structure of enslavement of Black men and women in the South. So this is also what is interesting to me. And I know, Pete, you may have the sense too, like in a lot of our fields in history, we're really siloed. So that, the historians of the American West and historians of the Civil War are almost never in conversation with one another, which is why I'm super excited that we are having a joint conference, if we can ever travel again, and go to conferences again in 2024. So hopefully by then, we'll be back to the But the Southern and the Western are meeting together.
Oh, really?
Kansas City.
Oh, nice. Yeah,
which I've been calling the Shawa, which I think we should all call it that.
But, I don't think that's going to stick.
Yeah. I think that's going to be great, because that's going to kind of call for, I think the expectation is going to be that we're going to have panels and discussions that include Civil War and Western historians. And then, of course, they're the people, the folks who do Civil War borderland history are like, finally, let's get some attention here. But I think that it's always been very interesting to me that, most Civil War histories don't take the West into account at all. And many Western histories kind of talk a little bit about the Civil War, but really kind of jump over it in a kind of longer, they tend to be longer durée kind of histories of the American West. But definitely the very large and long-standing trade in Hispano and Native men and women, and mostly the most coveted were women and children, as kind of either captives or slaves in warfare or raiding. That has been the subject of a lot of really good scholarship in U.S. West and Indigenous histories. So if people are interested in that, I would point them, especially to those books, to Brooks's book and Resendez's book. They're both Bancroft Prize winners, both just immaculate research for sure. Yeah. Are we going to? Are we going to talk about Louisa Canby?
Yeah, let's go back to it. You've got this, as John pointed out, this, I think, imaginative approach. And I think there's a very good comparison to Killer Angels. I'm actually inspired by you and by Shar. I'm trying to do something similar, because what we need, Megan, is another book on the Battle of Gettysburg. And we have it.
Today. What do we need?
I got to do it. I live in Gettysburg. I have to do it. But
The hole in the historiography.
Baby, it's huge, huge. I'll fill it. Tell us. She's a very, oops, there she is.
Yes.
Good. All right. Can you give us a little background, but more importantly, her story? It's a powerful one.
Yeah.
What are the takeaways?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Louisa Canby was married to ERS Canby, who was in charge after a couple of resignations of his superiors, was in charge of the Department of New Mexico and the Union Army in New Mexico in the first phase of the war. And she is someone who I think we would consider to be an Army wife. We would kind of call her that today. They got married in the late 1830s, both from Indiana. Yep. And then her family, many of them moved to Kentucky. But she traveled with him to almost every posting that he had, including Florida during the Seminole Wars. They were in California during the statehood fight in 1850. And then she went with him to Utah as part of the Mormon War campaign. And then they went from there, they stayed out there for a couple of years, and then they ended up in New Mexico. And her husband, who I think Civil War historians know as Edward R.S. Canby, but what I discovered when I went to the Filson Historical Society and looked at the records is that his entire family called him Richard, and I had written him as Edward. All of these things. And then I went to the Filson and was like, oh, Richard. And then I had to go back through. I was like, find and replace. And it was a different way of kind of thinking about him. But so I refer to him as Richard throughout, even though officially he kind of signed everything ERS. But what I wanted, one of the reasons I chose Louisa Canby is that I wanted to give readers a sense of what it was like to be a civilian on the ground, an Anglo civilian during this conflict. And Louisa Canby was in Santa Fe during the entire kind of campaign. She did not flee on the Santa Fe Trail. She did not go home. She chose to stay, even when Union troops abandoned the city as the Confederates were marching northward. And she ended up marshaling all of the other women in the town to gather medical supplies and food. She knew there was going to be a big battle. She knew that when the Confederates left Santa Fe and started to march toward Fort Union, there was going to be another army there, and they were going to meet them. And she knew there was going to be a big battle, and they would probably withdraw to Santa Fe. And so she wanted to be ready. And because of that, and because she actually did do a great deal to nurse Confederate soldiers and to bring them in injured soldiers from the battlefield, they ended up calling her the Angel of Santa Fe in the years after the war. And so she really exemplifies another turn in Civil War history that we've had recently toward what we're calling the Home Front War. So there's a new edited collection out, edited by Leanne Weitz and Lisa Frank, that takes this kind of concept. And Santa Fe is a perfect example of that. They were under Confederate occupation for several weeks during this campaign. And there's an interesting kind of interaction between civilians and Confederate occupiers, and then the Union troops kind of move in after the Confederates retreat. And Louisa Canby has an interesting role to play in that entire situation, in the way that she negotiates her life there. You know, she's sort of suspected of giving up the location of Navajo stores and supplies that were meant for Navajos after actually her husband negotiated a treaty with them, and she gave them away to the Confederates. And so she was suspected kind of treason for a couple of weeks there, but then that kind of subsided, and everybody just sort of chose to forgive her for that transgression because she had showed mercy in this war.
So I'm going to jump in another question here, John, if you don't mind. Sure. So again, I think one of the great contributions of this book is that we're able to see these events through the perspective of Native people. And you've recovered that in ways that I, at least again, my knowledge or my reading is maybe not as up to date as it should be, but I hope you can help us understand, what does it mean to you when the Civil War became an Indian War? And what I'm really trying to angle toward as well is help us understand not the single Native perspective. I'm going to stay on my hobby horse about this, right? There are many perspectives, not an Indian perspective. So
right. Yeah. Sure. Well, I mean, what happened was that James Henry Carlton, who's a career military man, just as the Confederates were marching back from the disaster at Glorietta, when Union troops were able to burn their entire wagon train, and you couldn't survive in the Southwest without a wagon train, so they had no choice but to retreat to Texas. While they were retreating 1,000 miles on that road, there was a 2,000-man army coming from California under James Henry Carlton. And, Carlton is a fascinating figure. He's one of the 9 protagonists in the book. He, moved these 2,000 men across the desert more than 800 miles in the middle of spring and summer and didn't lose a man to anything but the Battle of Picacho Pass. Which is astonishing to think about in terms of logistics, like how he was able to prepare them for that march and to do that. And yet, once he got to the Rio Grande and once Canby left, and he took over the Department of New Mexico in September of 1862, and he pivoted almost immediately to Indian campaigns. And he, wrote to the War Department, had no trouble, getting approval for these campaigns because, in his view, this was, the continuation of the Union's attempt to control the West. That they had successfully defended it from Confederate invasion, but now they had to secure it from Native peoples. And what that meant was defeating as many Native groups in the area in war as possible, forcing them to surrender, and then removing them to reservations where they could be controlled and surveilled. So that was the plan. There would be no more treaty making. This was Carlton's kind of theory, and he had a lot of supporters in the War Department at this point, and then later when Grant and then Sherman kind of took over, they had this, sort of evolving Indian policy that said, there will be no more peace treaties. We're going to, make war upon these peoples, and if it has to be a war of extermination, then that's just how it's going to be. But the goal ultimately would be more of a cultural annihilation, so that was the point of it, and the strategy was hard war. So this is also another interesting component for people who are interested in kind of ways of war and methods. The Civil War campaigns against Chiricahua Apaches, Mescalero Apaches, and Navajos, it bears a very strong resemblance to the campaigns that would come later with Pope and with Sherman. So, their intent was to destroy Native people's ability to live in their homelands and then remove them from those homelands and, again, contain them on a reservation to kind of pave the way for white settlers and farmers and ranchers and merchants and miners in particular. The gold was very interesting. And there was a gold strike in Arizona in 1863, which just gave fuel to that kind of fire. And Carlton was very much invested, like literally invested in gold mining opportunities in Arizona.
Conflict of interest there.
Literally. So that's what those campaigns were all about. And they were kind of on behalf of the Union Army. They were run out of the War Department, not the Department of Interior. And Carlton called the Navajos, who ended up, almost 10,000 of them, at Bosque Redondo, which was the reservation in central New Mexico. He called them his prisoners. So, this was a, I think we can consider it a prisoner of war situation. That is akin in its kind of human health and rights disaster to Andersonville, for sure. And what's interesting to me about this too is Carlton, was a logistical genius, but his logistical genius completely failed him, or he just kind of ignored it in relation to Bosque Redondo. I mean, he deliberately chose that spot. Many of his officers kind of looked at it and said, we really need to be 40 miles north at a better location. And he was like, that's too close to the Santa Fe Trail. It's going to be where it's going to be. And it created this huge disaster. There's no way that the Navajos could farm that land. The river was alkaline. I mean, and he single-handedly kind of created that human rights disaster at Bosque Redondo. And, I think you can make an argument there that, that might be kind of akin to Mark Neely's argument, that when, engaging in logistics to protect his own men, he was like on point. But when he's engaging in logistics, trying to kind of contain Native peoples, he was not. And he completely failed. And there was a 20 to 25% mortality rate at Bosque Redondo. But those were Union Army troops. Those were soldiers that were mustered into the Union Army who were engaging in those campaigns.
And I'm not pulling back from one of my earlier comments, but maybe just a little bit to say that what Megan has just told us is an example of where what we do in terms of our scholarship makes a great deal of difference. It is the recovering and the telling of those stories that are, again, so incredibly powerful and clearly have a legacy that people are reckoning with today. So, I'm so glad that you shared that with me.
Yeah, I do want to be careful to say that the only reason that I was able to tell those stories in the Three-Cornered War is because Native scholars and community members and elders created oral histories. They preserved items from this period, and they've written histories that are published and available to me as a non-Native scholar. It would not have been possible to know the details of Juanita's life, who is the Navajo woman who, from whose perspective you are, learning about all of these things in the Three-Cornered War. It would be impossible without the work of two women, Jennifer Nez Danette Dale, who is a historian at University of New Mexico, wrote a book about Juanita and Manuelito. And also, so there's her photograph. And also has written many, many articles on her. She is Danette Dale's ancestor. And also Ruth Rossell, who collected oral histories and also wrote a really wonderful history of women in Navajo society, which I relied upon heavily for kind of giving us some context. Because Juanita did not leave any written records. She left material culture, textiles, and she also left some oral histories in the family. But I was able to kind of recreate this story and integrate it into this kind of larger history of Civil War America because of the work of those important historians.
Megan, I first met you.
John, do we have any comments, questions that you'd like to bring to the table here?
I first met you, Megan, back in 2013, and it was at Gettysburg College where I first met Megan. And you just came out with Ruined Nation. And I don't know if Pete has a copy there ready to go or not. But were there any points from Ruined Nation that helped you with, like, when you're talking about these deserts and vast landscapes and environments? And for those who don't know, your Ruined Nation is your environmental history piece that you did in 2012, I believe it was.
Yeah.
And were there any points in that research in that book that kind of helped you with understanding some of the landscapes that you were discussing in the Three-Cornered War? Yeah, there's Ruined Nation.
Also a very pretty book. University of Georgia. Also a beautiful cover. So I am an environmental historian. That is the sort of thread running through all three of my books. And so I really value not only kind of digging through the sources to kind of get at environmental detail of climate and weather and flooding and snowstorms, things like that, and also the lay of the land, kind of what material resources are available. So when I started to look at the southwestern deserts, I knew this was going to be really interesting from an environmental perspective, because this is probably the harshest natural environment in which to try to fight a war, and especially to try and fight a war in the way that the Union and Confederacy were trying to do it. I think we're used to talking about how these sort of these new technologies, killing technologies in terms of riflery and things like that, kind of crashed up against these more traditional methods of fighting with the mass charges and things like that. And that's part of what created this just, incredible casualty rate during the Civil War. In the Southwest, it's, these two armies that seem very small by Eastern comparison, right? They're kind of 3,000, 4,000 men. But trying to move 3,000 men more than 600 miles across a desert is just a nightmare. I mean, there's a reason these, even though, these seem like such small engagements in the context of these other kind of Eastern Theater and Trans-Mississippi battles, these are the largest armies that this region has ever seen and will ever see. Like, this is not the mode of fighting because it's not conducive. The environment is not conducive to it. The water resources are too far apart. There's not enough for thousands of people at the same time and their animals. So the natural environment really shaped the way that the war turned out. And so I used the landscape as a source. I went in 2014. I drove from Boston out to Colorado, and then I did a 3-month kind of research stint, and I drove everywhere. And it was really important for me to see as many sites as possible. And I think I went to almost all of them that were open to the public. Val Verde is not open to the public. It is on private ranching land, owned by Ted Turner, in fact.
He's a Civil buff, then. He's a Civil buff. Yeah.
Perhaps you should donate the Val Verde land.
Absolutely.
Or the National Park Service. That'd be awesome. So I really wanted to go see these places, and I can just give you a very quick example of this. Let's see if I can actually share the screen in a way that is helpful. Yes, I can. So I just wanted to show you this in terms of using landscape as a source. This is 2 different views of Baylor Pass, which readers of the Three-Cornered War will see in Chapter 1. So John Baylor is the sort of vanguard of Confederate Manifest Destiny. He invades New Mexico territory from Texas in July of 1861, takes and occupies the town of Mesilla, and then drives this garrison of 400 troops, 400 to 500 troops from Fort Fillmore up and over the Oregon Mountains, which are kind of off to the right-hand side in this left-hand image of Baylor Pass here. And what I didn't realize, and the reason I included this picture from the road, which is going parallel to the mountains, so that the trail is kind of moving up and to the right, the road is level. And what I didn't get from reading all the sources, there are a lot of battle reports of this engagement where Baylor is chasing these troops from Las Cruces, which is in the river valley of the Rio Grande, up to and over this pass, San Augustine Pass, in the Oregon Mountains. And nobody in the written sources kind of mentions anything about the road, except that everyone was slowing down, they were getting exhausted, they were getting sunstroke, and they were getting dehydrated. And I didn't figure out until I was there, as you can see from the second picture, they would have been moving steadily upward from that river valley all the way to the mountains. And I think we have this sense of the desert in the Southwest as being completely flat and just sandy. And as you can see here, it's full of vegetation and it is sloping upward. And then I confirmed this by riding my bike up the road, and getting slower and slower as I was going. And I was like, well, no wonder, right? Here are these people trying to, walk or ride or drag, and they have wagons and they are on a sandy road and everyone's slowing down. It's late July in the 90s and they're at about a 2 or 3% grade the entire time, which again, doesn't seem like a lot, but go ride a bike 10 miles, 3% grade, and then come back and tell me that it is not right. And then of course the road kicked up over the pass and the grade got even more extreme. And so Baylor was able to catch up with them. Half of the Federals were just collapsed on the side of the road because there's no water in between the Rio Grande and, this pass. And they had either not brought enough with them, or they didn't drink enough, or they had, had a taste of the whiskey supplies that were being destroyed at Fort Fillmore before they left. And everyone knows how that goes. That's great for your dehydration. So this is one of those moments when being in the landscape and seeing it myself and using it as a source, I understood what was going on in that historical moment by looking at the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's just one example. But that, as an environmental historian, I find it very useful to actually go to places, which is why it's so frustrating right now, because I am currently writing a book on Yellowstone, and I was supposed to be in Yellowstone in 2 weeks. So this is how the pandemic is really hurting a lot of historians, including me, so we can't travel and go to the places that we're writing about, which is
Yellowstone when is it officially a national park?
1872, March 1st, 1872, which is why I am writing the book now, and which is why I'm on a tight deadline, because I would like that book to come out on the 150th anniversary.
Yeah,
right.
How exciting! That sounds like a fantastic project.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, but that I do need to. I've not been to Yellowstone since I was 8, so I need to go back because my memories of it are faulty.
I was there when I was 8 or 9 as well. That's my last trip. Yeah,
that's when we were separated from each other.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Jumped off with a bunch of bears. And,
apparently, we do have someone in the West, or who enjoys the West, and they asked the question for you. Do you talk about the Colorado Volunteers Sand Creek Massacre in any way, Megan?
I talk a little bit about the Sand Creek Massacre, from the viewpoint of James Carlton and the actions that are going on. Right around the same time, Carlton had sent Kit Carson out with the 1st New Mexico, which is the most diverse fighting force in the entire Civil War, which included Hispanic volunteers and also Native scouts and spies and auxiliaries from multiple tribes. He had sent them out after Kiowas and Comanches. And so they fought the Battle of Adobe Walls right around the same time as the Sand Creek Massacre. And so I talk about it a little bit. It's not a focus of the book because I did try, even though the book kind of expands the chronology from 61 to 68, I was trying to keep a fairly tight focus on that sort of corridor of New Mexico and Arizona. But those Colorado volunteers, many of them had been at the Battle of Glorieta as part of the 1st Colorado, and then they were kind of reorganized into a different group. So they had been responsible, and John Shivington was the kind of hero of Glorieta. He was the one who led a third of that fighting force kind of around the back and burned that wagon train. So he was quite famous already at that point, which is why he could kind of galvanize all of these troops in Denver under the sort of name of the 3rd Colorado and go down to Sand Creek and attack this peaceful camp of Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples. But it was part of, as well as there was another engagement very similar to that in southern Utah, northern Utah, I'm sorry, the Bear Creek Massacre in January of 1863, which was occurring kind of around the same moment that Union troops are capturing Mangus Coloradus in southern Arizona, which you'll read about in the Three-Cornered War. So this is part of a larger pattern of Union troops being kind of sent out to fight Indians, and often that turned into attacks on peaceful villages and peaceful camps. And in fact, Sand Creek did cause a congressional investigation, which brought a couple senators and congressmen not only to Sand Creek to kind of interview people there and at Fort Lyon, but also brought them to Bosque Redondo in 1865 to investigate how the Union Army had been treating Native peoples. And at that point, that report was not printed until 1867, but it was quite influential in convincing Congress that perhaps Bosque Redondo was not working, and that some kind of resolution needed to be made, and perhaps that would mean sending Navajos back to their homeland.
Well, Megan, let me just say that the importance of this book is in helping us expand our understanding of the war within these grander processes that are so important. And so, as you pointed out at the beginning, that we have all talked about free labor ideology and the importance of the territories in the West, and then the war came, and then suddenly all of that is forgotten. And I'm reminded by your book and our conversation tonight of Brian Lusky, who wrote Men is Cheap, that we see during the war that free labor, a euphemism, watch out for the language, right? There's nothing free about labor and capitalism. And then we see coercive labor forces come to the surface. And then with your, again, beautifully written book, and what is, seductive about the book is it's incredibly creative. You do microhistory better than anyone that I've read in a very long time. But let's not get seduced here. And what Megan is telling us today is that this is the war of imperialism. We need to recognize that as part of the Civil War. And that expansion to the West is not just free labor. And it's not just white supremacy, which you and I might go around about that just a little bit. But it's very much about the resources there. It's about the land there. And that, of course, brought them in conflict with Native people. To not have that part of the story is it's just to utterly misunderstand the very coming of the Civil War itself and what was at stake. So, Megan, again, thank you so much for two things. One, for this beautiful book, and two, for reminding us to have this conversation about George Floyd at this very important time. We've had a lot of good times together. You've been a very dear friend to me when I was sick. I'll never forget that you came and you visited me in Gettysburg. And also what I'll never forget, I can't say this, I'd say it quickly. I can't say that to any woman in this world, we'll always have Paris. But I can say that to one man, and that is, ready? It is Megan Kate Nelson's husband, Dan. I'm walking down the street in Paris with my family. I said, I want to read and get a drink. And Beth said, well, just go here. I said, okay, I will. I'm sitting there reading, and I get a text from Megan, and she said, I think Dan is at the bar right across from me. This wasn't, in Saint Germain. It wasn't on Saint Germain. It was just some side street in Paris.
Wow.
So, yeah, he had met you somewhere. Lincoln dinner or something. He had met you somewhere. And so he texted me. He was in Europe on some work trip or something. And so he went to this bar to eat, and he texted me and said, is Pete Carmichael in Paris? Like, he is. And he's like down, he's reading some book on like Monet, like down. You text him and see, it was hysterical. Yes.
Wow. So Dan and I will always have Paris. It's so wonderful to see you. And I can't wait to give you an abrazo in person whenever that day or year might come.
I'm so bummed about the CWI. I'm so bummed because I think I was supposed to see John there and do this thing live.
Absolutely, you were slated, and C-SPAN was excited about your program. But we're going to be back. Megan has been a wonderful contributor to CWI. We've done some teacher conferences back in the day when I did teacher conferences, which I so miss. And so, John, again, Megan, we can't. You talked about before about people doing things to make connections. And John, has taken this as really sort of his battle cry. He's been doing it long before he and I ever got together. And so, John, thank you again for arranging this and being more than a facilitator. It's really important stuff.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pete. Thank you for believing in it. Thank you, Megan, for being on. And I know that originally it was going to be you and I talking. Pete's like, no, we're taking this one. We're doing this together.
I asked nicely. I said I'd like to be part of it.
Yeah. I wrote to John and I was like, is that okay?
Yeah, she did. She emailed me. She's like, Pete wants in on it. Like, yeah, it's fine. Whatever. I'm used to it. It's okay. But no, thank you also for earlier for pushing us to think of some larger issues that are involving us today. And I think that's very, very important. And Pete is holding up the book for our next presenter.
Living by Riches, a sensory history of Civil War prisons. It's beautifully written. And for those of you who think, what in God's name does it mean to do a history of the census? Well, you'll find out on Thursday. Thursday, 7:00.
That's right. It brings back a lot of memories of us doing interpretation and trying to get people to smell and hear things that aren't there. So
All of it. Yeah.
there it is.
Could be a lot of fun.
But thank you again, Megan, for being on. We appreciate it so very much.
For having
I know a lot of people in the comments are saying they're going to pick up your book, so I hope everyone does so. Please do it. It's awesome. I loved it, and I know Pete loved it too. So, Pete, thank you again for a wonderful conversation and for making sure that nun is watching over you again for another evening. We really appreciate that.
She is special. You see her?
There she is.
Yep, there she is. There she is. So thank you all for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We will see you on Thursday evening.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, you guys. Bye.
Right, you can stay on it, Megan, if you want.
Down. Okay.